Okay, now let's try to review everything we have learned so far about these kinds of charts. So what are the different types of charts in IELTS Writing Task 1? Well, that's easy. We had a line graph, we had the bar chart, we had the table, the pie chart, the flow chart, and finally, the map. All right, so we basically have 5 categories. If you add the combination chart to it, you actually have 7. But what you need to remember is that the combination chart isn't a separate type of chart. It's a combination of the previous 6, right? So again, we might have a line graph and a table forming a combination chart. We might have a bar chart and a pie chart forming a combination chart. Sometimes we have multiple pie charts. So you might have 4 pie charts forming a combination chart or a combination task, if you will. But one thing you should note is that the combination chart will never combine qualitative and quantitative data. So you will rarely, if ever, find a line graph and a map put together. Why is that? Because a line graph is quantitative and a map is qualitative, right? Okay, so let's categorize the data very quickly. Line graph. What kind of information were we dealing with? Well, we were dealing with quantitative data. And was it discrete or interval? It was interval, right? So quantitative data, interval. And when I say interval, I mean we can view describes changes in quantities, I think this is the best way to put it, over time. Okay, there. Let's move on to the second category. So the bar chart, once again, it was quantitative in nature, but the difference was that this time the data seemed to be discrete, meaning it doesn't describe changes over time, but describes quantities across different groups or categories. This is very important, right? So I'll just add this here. And as you can see, it's quantitative and it is discrete, showing the changes in the quantities across categories, right? Not over time. What about a table? Once again, we had numbers, so it was quantitative, and it was just like most bar charts that you see, discrete. And what does that mean? It means we can say that once again, it describes quantities across categories, right? So we can see that here we have discrete data, which describes quantities across different groups or categories. Okay. Now, before we proceed, I just have to point out something very quickly. I know that I told you that bar charts and tables are discrete. However, sometimes on the exam, the examiner or the test designer will try to trick you. It's not impossible for a bar chart to have time on its quantitative axis, and instead of showing the variables using a line, you just have all these bars next to each other and you can trace the change over time. Don't be fooled by surface level variations. Pay attention to what the data is showing, okay? So most of the time it'll be discrete, but be on the lookout, watch out for instances where For example, a table could have the years shown in its columns from, let's say, 2021 to 2024, right? So as you can see, we can trace the changes over time, even though it's a table. But these cases are quite rare. What about flowchart? Once again, I think you would agree with me that this is quantitative and that it is discrete, which means it's describing quantities across different groups again. But there's a slight difference that I perhaps didn't mention in my previous explanation. And that is, in a pie chart, we're dealing with a fixed amount. Do you see? It's like a pie or a pizza where you can see a share from a total sum. So everything adds up to 100%. So now what you do is you don't just see different categories, you also see proportions, fractions, and percentages, right? So in a table, you may have percentages. In a bar chart, you may have percentages, but in a pie chart, you always have percentages and a fixed total amount. So keep that in mind, even though we're going to review this later in one of our future lectures. What about a flow chart? Now, in a flow chart, we were dealing with qualitative data, meaning we didn't really have numbers anymore. We were looking at qualitative changes, how paper is produced. So we saw the process, right? And the way we can describe this is it basically shows, or it describes, how changes have occurred over time, right? That's what this type of chart is primarily dealing with. Finally, a map, very similar to a flowchart. It is qualitative, and once again, it's describing, it's showing a process, which is basically revealing how changes have occurred over time. This time, we usually have a location, right? A map where something has been added, something's been removed, something's been altered. And so these are the different kinds of charts. Now, we've seen all these different categories, but what I'm trying to teach you here is that you shouldn't really be fooled by all these surface level variations. At the end of the day, what are the categories of data in the IELTS exam? It's very simple. We have 3 different types of charts, regardless of the surface level, right? Essentially, you need to learn to write 3 types of reports. 1, quantitative, interval. This is when you get a line graph or maybe a bar chart that shows time, variation across time on one of its axes, or maybe a table that has time for columns or rows. This essentially would require you to write a quantitative and interval report. The second category is quantitative discrete. This is when you get a bar chart that's comparing different categories, a pie chart, or a table which doesn't have time as either the column or listed in its rows. So this is the second type of data. And the third type of data that we have is basically qualitative data, which tends to be process in nature. And what we are going to do in the remainder of this course is we're going to learn how to develop a meaningful response that matches the expectations listed on the rubric for each of these types of reports. We're going to learn structures for each category, and then towards the end of this course, I will write a sample response for each of these types for you. And so just by following my lead, by learning these structures, you will be very well positioned to form a very good response on the day of your test. All right, that's it for today's lesson, guys. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this content, please share, like, and subscribe. Catch you all in the next one.